second part of Unit 6. So if you went through the first part, these are some of the questions you should hit on. As you're answering these questions, make sure that you're really detailed. Don't just answer them at a very surface level. Go back and really get into the details of what I've said for these answers, and that should help you a lot when you go to study for your exam. So let's go to part 2 of this Unit 6. And so when we're actually talking about the inside of an organism, basically when we're looking at tissues, the tissues can be kind of localized through the use of membranes. And so there are several different types of membranes, and membranes are usually composed of more than one type of tissue and are used to cover either underlying tissue or secrete fluids. So there's what's known as cutaneous membranes. And so a perfect example of this is skin, right? And it's made of both epithelial and connective tissue. Now, the mucosous membranes that you'll see, these are ones that you can find that line cavities and tubes. And so these essentially are the ones that open to the outside. So if we're talking about these, you can think the oral cavity or nasal cavities. You can think of tubes, and I'm going to go over here, right? Tubes that are in the digestive system, the urinary system, or the reproductive system. And so the mucosous membranes normally consist of epithelial that has an overlying. So the epithelium is over normally a layer of what's known as alveolar connective tissue. And this guy, just like the word says, it secretes mucus. And if you remember, what was mucus? It was a combination of that molecule mucin mixed with water. Now, here we have serous membranes, right? Do you guys remember where you find serous membranes? We talked about it in lab. And so, let me kind of make it so that these are easier to see. So, serous membranes can be found in they line body cavities. And these body cavities don't open, right? Let me put don't open to outside. And so essentially why they're there, what did I tell the whole reason serous membranes, or what the function behind them essentially is? Remember, it reduces friction. And that's between organs, so you can go organ to organ, or the cavity walls. And what does it secrete? It secretes serous fluid. And synovial membranes we're going to get to a little bit later. And basically these, and I'm going to put it over here, lines joints. What do you think it secretes? If you said synovial fluid, you would be right. And so these basically, the synovial fluids help to lubricate the certain joints in the body. And the little asterisk is there is because if you're reading through here, it's not going to talk about it. But when we get into joints itself, it talks about synovial membrane. So I wanted to add that here. So let's look at this cutaneous, and we're going to just kind of review over all of them again, just so that you know. Of course, cutaneous membranes, you can see here, they're on the skin. So again, this is the main area that you can find them. Mucous membrane, these are going to line the cavities that are open to the outside, right? The next one's going to be not open to the outside. So, and they secrete. What do they secrete? Mucus, right? And so you can see both here, the nasal cavity. You can see it in the oral cavity. You can see it all the way down through the esophagus, right? Through the digestive system. You can see it in the urinary system. Of course, we're going to go into the mucosa of the bronchi because, again, this is going through the nasal cavity, through the reproductive system down here. So there are any of those cavities that are open to the exterior or the outside. And these are serous membranes, right? We talked about these. So the pleura, which is the lungs, right? Oops. Here, right? And you can see here the periodal is the outside, right, towards the thoracic wall here. And the visceral is going to be on the inside, right, towards the organ. Pericardium is the one that's associated with the heart. And the peritoneum is the one that's basically going to hold all these essentially digestive organs in the abdominal region. Now, whenever we have a problem within our body, there's always these small kind of issues that happen in our body that a lot of times we're not even aware about. Essentially, there's a process of tissue repair that happens. So anytime our body's barrier is compromised, there is an inflammatory and immune response that's activated. And the repair is very, very quick. And the repair is a function of the inflammatory process itself. So this is impertinent to happen whenever necessary when barriers are penetrated. Cell division must occur. So we talked a little bit at the beginning of this class about essentially having mitosis happening, right? And so if you remember mitosis, this was the idea that you had one cell, then it replicates its DNA, and then it divides in half. And so cells divide, and then they end up moving to the area where they need to be. So it occurs in two major ways. There's a regeneration process, where some kinds of tissues will replace the destroyed tissue with new tissue, right? So here, this is the main important point of this, is that you get essentially the same function for the cells that have been made or the new tissue as the original tissue. So this is the one that we really want, right, whenever we have damage. Some tissues, specifically connective tissues, replace, what happens is you'll have your initial tissue and it will get replaced, sorry with that, connective tissue, right? So the destroyed tissue becomes connective tissue, which means if you have something getting replaced by something that it's not, then you've lost original function. And this happens a lot in the heart. This happens, certain times you can find this also in the liver, right? You can actually find both types in the liver. But fibrosis is very, very common in heart tissue that essentially gets damaged. Sorry, guys.
Tissue organs in the body repair injury through a multi-step process that begins as platelets from torn vessels work to form a mesh-like clot that prevents blood loss. Inflammation in the area occurs as tissue repair begins in the damaged area. Mast cells release histamine that dilates blood vessels and increases blood flow to the repair site. White blood cells, called neutrophils, and macrophages work to consume bacteria and remove damaged tissue and debris. As bacteria and dead cells are removed, the proliferative phase of wound healing begins. Fibroblasts build new tissue by secreting collagen that takes the shape of the original tissue. During remodeling, the final phase of wound healing, the tissue created by the fibroblasts matures and regains its normal function.
So that's a quick video to talk a little bit about it. So let's talk it in steps, these next few steps. So what we have here is step 1. And so you're going to see in this part that essentially you get the inflammation stage actually sets in here. And so what you're going to see here is you're going to get a release of inflammatory chemicals. Your blood vessel is going to dilate, and that's going to increase vessel permeability, right? It's going to get bigger, more things can flow there, and then it's also going to be able to exit out of the blood vessel easier. And this is where clotting occurs. So if you actually look at this picture, right, what you're seeing right here is this basically this damage happening, right? And so this is in the skin. So basically, you want to stop any kind of bleeding that's happening right there. So what happens is you have this incision, and then inflammatory chemicals are going to be released, right? And they do this because they want to get rid of that initial problem that's happening. There's a loss of blood, there's damage there. If it's open to the outside like this one, right, then essentially organisms from the outside can get in. So they're going to want to be able to kind of close that off and start repairing that as soon as possible. So essentially what's going to happen is you're going to have that these guys right here, this artery, is going to dilate, so it gets bigger so that more blood can get there, and then it becomes more permeable, which is going to allow things like white blood cells to actually be able to leave from these arteries to that damaged site faster, right? It's also going to allow all kinds of proteins and clotting proteins to get there. You want the clotting proteins because you want this to form on the top, that scab, right? If you can form that scab there, essentially what it's doing is it's stopping blood loss, but more importantly, it stops things from being able to get in, right? So essentially clotting is going to occur there, and it's going to dry on the surface, form a scab, so then we can end up fixing all this area that's right underneath it. Let's go on to stage 2, which is when we start reorganizing stored blood supply. So the blood clot is replaced with a granulation tissue. Epithelium begins to regenerate. Fibroblast, and if you remember we talked about blast a little bit in the last video, that's going to be essentially the cells that are responsible for making things, right? They're going to start producing collagen fibers that kind of bridge the gap from one side to the next so that we can bring them back together. And then all the things that are broken in there, or anything that's been any kind of bacteria that's gotten in and been killed, it's all going to be phagocytized. So let's look at this really quick in the picture. So you can see that that scab is still there while we are essentially trying to fix everything. So essentially what's going to happen is that scab, do you see, this is where new tissue is going to start being formed. So we're going to replace all this scab tissue, old clotted tissue, with granulation tissue. And granulation tissue is going to be that tissue that starts allowing all the cells to be formed, right? That's also going to allow a blood supply to start being generated for those lower layers here, right? Fibroblasts, you can see basically these guys right here are going to start producing collagen fibers, and you can see the fibers here to help bridge the two sides. And then if you look, you have all these things like these guys right here, macrophages. These are basically the guys that are going to come in and they're going to get rid of any of the dead and dying cells that are there and any other debris, all the junk there. So they're the cleaners, right? And then as you go, you have all this layer right here, this basement membrane layer right there. And so what you're going to see there is the surface of the epithelial tissue is going to start migrating over from this granulation tissue, and then you're going to start repairing and moving all of this to basically fill it in with new tissue. Now, that's step 2, and so now we're going to go and look at step 3, the final step in tissue repair. And this is where either you're going to see regeneration or fibrosis. The scab is going to detach at this point, and fibrous tissue matures. The epithelium will thicken and begin to look like everything around it, right? And at this point, it will result in fully regenerated epithelium with underlying scar tissue. But if any of the areas underneath it don't exactly regenerate right, then what it'll replace is essentially fibrotic tissue. And it's going to kind of show you here how that works. So here we had all of this, basically the fibrotic tissue, and then you have mitosis, and those new cells were going to migrate up to this area in the epithelium. So this has new tissue that essentially acts like the skin tissue, right? The problem down here is that you ended up having that connective tissue come across. So there are areas of this that are going to be fibrotic, and so they're going to mature and essentially contracts, and you got this area here that is replaced with some of the non-functioning tissue. And then you have here epithelium thickens here, and then you're going to actually have skin tissue. So here is a completely regenerated wound, right? And so you have regenerated epithelium, but the underlying area underneath that is essentially scar tissue. And that's the reason why when you get a cut sometimes, you'll have that bumped up area, because you have the connective tissue, the scar tissue underneath the overlying epithelial tissue that's functioning just fine. And so you do have regenerative capacity that's different in different tissues. So things that get generated extremely well and fine are things like epithelial tissue, bone, areolar connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and blood forming tissue. All of those are fine. You damage them, they get fixed pretty easily. Things that have moderate regenerating capacity that will essentially work well but can have some fibrotic basically replacement are smooth muscle and dense irregular connective tissue. But there are things that virtually have no functional regenerative capacity, and one of those is basically cardiac muscle or your heart muscle, and certain parts in nervous tissue, the brain and spinal cord. Though there is new research that cell division does occur in some of those areas, efforts to kind of coax them to regenerate better is still in its early infant stage, and we're still working on being able to have that happen for us. And when we're looking at tissue, essentially looking at the developmental aspect of tissue, right? Essentially the superficial, when you're looking at the primary germ layer, there's a superficial to deep. And so it goes from superficial to deep from ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Those are the different layers that essentially those different tissues will arise from depending on where they're located. It's formed early in embryonic development, And they're specialized to form the 4 primary tissues, right? So nervous tissue arises from the ectoderm. Muscle and connective tissue will arise from the mesoderm, and all epithelial tissue arises from all 3 of these layers. Tissue function well through youth and middle age of giving adequate diet and circulation, and if wounds and infections are minimal. As the body ages, the epithelial thins, so they are more easily breached. That's why when you talk to people and they're older, it seems like they can get hurt so easily, or their skin seems to be like paper thin and essentially just kind of tear sometimes. And that's because it does get thinner as you age. Tissue repair is less efficient as you age because of this. Bone, muscle tissue, nervous tissue also begin to atrophy or, become less strong. And DNA mutations can increase cancer risk as you age too in tissues. And so this kind of gives you an idea of the embryonic germ layers and the primary tissues that produce each of those. And so this is a 16-day-old embryo, and you can see this blue part here is the ectoderm. So you can see at this point you have the nervous tissue that arises from that area and the epithelium. This next layer right here, as you can see, is the mesoderm, and if you look, muscle and connective tissue mostly arise from this layer. And this bottom layer here, which is the endoderm, right? Exo being out, endo being in, is where the digestive system comes from. But you can see in all times you get this epithelium there because you do have different tissue, epithelial tissue throughout your body, right? And so hopefully this kind of gives you can think nervous tissue as brain. This is how I remembered it from the top. Muscles are kind of in the middle, but at the center of your body or at the very bottom of it, as you're going from superficial outside to inside, right, is the digestive system. So that's how I remembered stuff mostly. As you go through, if you need some extra help, I've put it online, and you can look through Mr. Ford, introductory to body positions, body cavities, planes, and abdominal cavities, can really help you with anything that you're confused on, and lab exercises, or even online if you need to study. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. So let's talk about body positions. You are responsible for knowing this, and this should be a review, right, since we've gone over it in lab. So if you're going up towards the head, that's superior. Down towards the feet is inferior. If you're looking at the back area, that is either known as posterior or dorsal. Towards the belly is called anterior and ventral. So realize if you're looking at an animal that essentially has a head, its legs down here, when you're talking about ventral or anterior, some people like to think anterior means towards the head, but anterior ventral would be down towards the belly. Now the head, if you're talking about something, would go down this way, right? But keep that in mind if you're ever talking about these positions in relationship to like your dog or your cat. Proximal as a point towards the body, distal as in distance far away, right? Lateral is towards the outside. Medial is towards, you think M for middle. So these guys give you a good idea of the different basically positions. Body planes, right? And so you can look at the different planes, or sometimes I talk about cut. And so sagittal is when you separate right from left. Oops. Right from left, right? And so on here, a mid-sagittal is when you're in the middle. Right? So mid would be in the middle. If you're slightly off to the side, that's known as parasagittal. Transverse is when you're cutting top from bottom, right? This is basically left from right. And this is ventral from dorsal, right? And so if you want to practice some of these on your own, I'm not going to put it on here. This is great. You can go, and this is a movie called Ghost Ship. I show this in lecture, but since you're doing it on your own, you can actually watch some of this on your own. And so if you look for the intro to Ghost Ship, it can show you the very first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie, shows you some good examples of the cut, and you can go through and identify the different cuts in this horror movie if you like to. A next one is the part with the lawyer on 13 Ghosts. So you can type in lawyer 13 Ghosts. You'll get something that looks like this, right? And it gives you an idea. He'll be walking down the hallway with these glasses on. You just watch it. It's about 5 minutes long. And you can go whenever the lawyer gets put down. You can figure out what kind of basically plane or cut that is. And the last one here that you can look at is called The Cell with Jennifer Lopez. And you can put Cell Horse. And it's going to be her and a little boy talking together, and they'll kind of have a moment which includes a horse. Nobody is hurt at all in the production of any of these. And the horse is kind of an interesting one to look at because a lot of people end up getting this one wrong. So you can go through and take a look at those. So those are 3 absolutely fantastic horror movies that if you were in class with me, I would show. But on here, I'm going to give you the opportunity, if you like to actually go and check those out online and search them. If you can't find them, then you're more than welcome to email me and I can send you those links. So body cavities, we talked about this. There are dorsal cavities, which include the cranial cavity and the ventral. The cranial has the brain. And the ventral cavity here has the spinal cord. You have the thoracic cavity, which we also subdivided. And the thoracic cavity can be subdivided into basically what we'll look at here in a second, which is the pleural cavities and the basically the pericardial cavity. And these 2 cavities are separated by the diaphragm, the thoracic cavity, and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so these on this side are all ventral towards the belly, and this is the superior cavity, this is the inferior, and the abdominal pelvic is subdivided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So as we talked in class, sometimes you can have more than one answer, and essentially, unless I'm being very specific and I'm saying, give me specifically, be very specific, this cavity. Or if I just say, hey, where is this? You might have more than one answer that could be correct, but it's not going to be anything that's ambiguous. Now, if you look at this from the front, you can see the thoracic cavity is separated into basically the mediastinum, which is this area that is right there, which essentially right through this area, you'll get like the esophagus and the trachea and all that. And then the cavity that goes and actually houses the lungs is the pleural cavity. And then in here, you actually have the pericardium. So this kind of gives you an idea of the different cavities.
Hi, my name is Jody Chapman, and I'm here with Dr. Ricardo Gonzalez-Rothi to give you an inside look into the pleura and the pleural space. What is the pleura exactly?
The pleura is a continuous membrane of cells that folds over onto itself at the apex and at the base of each lung.
What is the pleural space?
Well, the pleural space is a potential space that's between the parietal pleura that lines the inside of the chest wall and the visceral pleura that lines the lungs as the 2 pleural membranes fold upon themselves.
What are the functions of the pleura and the pleural space?
The pleural space helps regulate the pressure inside and outside the lungs during breathing. It is thought that the fluid in the space provides lubrication for the pleural surfaces on the lungs and the chest wall as they slide against each other during the breathing cycle.
how much fluid is in the pleural space?
This virtual space is estimated to hold between 8 and 10 milliliters of fluid per side in an average-sized adult man. So it's not very much fluid, and under normal circumstances, that amount is held at a pretty fairly constant volume.
What is pleural fluid? What kind of substances would you find in it normally?
Pleural fluid is a very clear plasma filtrate, if you will, which originates from the small capillaries in the chest wall, and it contains small solutes like sodium, chloride, bicarbonate, also contains glucose, as well as the small amounts of protein, including albumin. And when compared with serum, pleural fluid actually has near equivalent concentrations of glucose, but it has slightly higher concentrations of albumin and bicarbonate. In fact, the increased bicarbonate concentration results in an alkalotic pH of about 7.6 under normal conditions. Pleural fluid also contains macrophages, lymphocytes, and mesothelial cells that exfoliate from the pleura, and these are also found in pleural fluid in low numbers under normal circumstances, generally under 1,700 cells per cubic millimeter.
What are the mechanics of the pleural space? How does it work?
The fluid in the pleural space provides mechanical coupling between the two pleural surfaces, and it actually allows instantaneous transmission of perpendicular forces between them.
What exactly do you mean by mechanical coupling?
The mechanism of mechanical coupling is similar to that which occurs, say, when a glass coaster sticks to the bottom of a slightly damp glass. You have the thin film of fluid between the two smooth surfaces, and this creates a partial vacuum that forces the two surfaces to cling to one another, yet allows the two surfaces to slide against each other. A similar situation occurs between the two pleural surfaces during breathing as the lungs expand and contract within the chest cavity.
So that kind of gives you an idea of how they work. I showed you that video quickly, but I think it's just really nice to kind of get an idea of being able to look and the importance of these serous membranes that we talked about. Now again, when we're talking about looking at the abdominal region and the abdominal cavity, they do subdivide that to get a little bit more specific into subdivisions. And so essentially first they have what are just these quadrants. Right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, lower quadrants, right and left, right? But then they go even more specific, and they do it into this tic-tac-toe kind of shape, where if you're looking at it, the right is on this side, the left is on this side because it goes due to anatomical positioning. And then on the top, on the left and right, you have the hypochondriac. Then you have the lumbar region, which is towards the lower back, but we're looking at the area in front of it, right? And then the iliac region has to do with the hip bones, right? So that kind of gives you an area on here. And then in the center, you have the umbilical region, which is the middle, kind of where your belly button is. And then above it is epigastric, because we're above that region there. And below it is hypogastric region. So the subdivisions for that area are such. And basically the last part of this is the body region, which you learned the other day. So you can just kind of go through it. For instance, you know, we don't call the head region, right? It's subdivided into several regions so that people can get very, very specific. For instance, you have the cephalic region on the very top. You have the frontal region here, orbital region, which is your eye, buccal region, which is around on where your cheekbones are, the mental, which is your chin, right? The oral, which is your mouth, the nasal, which is your nose, and the otic, which is your ear. The cervical is around your neck, you know. Acromial is this area that is kind of part of your shoulder. Axillary is your armpit. Your mammary is where your breast is. Brachial, which is your arm. Antecubital, which is that area where you're front of your elbow, right? Antebrachial, which is your forearm. You have your carpal, which is your wrist. Palmar, which is your palm, and your digitals, which are your fingers. If you're looking at your chest, you have the sternal, which is where your breastbone is in the middle. Pectoral, which is your chest, which is different than the mammary, which is around the nipple region, right? You have umbilical, which is your navel. Like lingual, which is this area that is kind of right in this hip region or lower region. Your coxal, which is towards the outside here. Genital region here. Patellar, which is your kneecap, right? Crural, which is your leg. Tarsal, which is that ankle region. The pedal, which is your foot. And this is both in the front and the leg in the back. Serous, which is your calf region right here, right? Popliteal, which is the back of your leg. Femoral, which is your thigh. Perineal, which is this middle area of your butt. The gluteal is your cheek or your buttocks itself. The sacral, which is the area between your hips here. Lumbar is lower back. Cubical is your elbow. Dorsal, which is your back. Brachial, which is your arm here. Vertebral is your spinal column. And basically, occipital is the back of your head. The other one I had already talked about. Acromial being part of your shoulder. So those are all the different body regions there, and you should have went over those as well when you were talking about it in lab. What is these? Oh, we will talk about this later. Sorry, I got you all excited and then we didn't do it. So that is it for this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you feel like you kind of are a good starting spot to start doing all your homework. And if you need anything else, just let me know.